The war had turned the skies of Silara into a battlefield of fire and smoke. Explosions rippled through the alien capital, shaking the towering spires of the royal palace. The air was thick with the scent of burning metal and the cries of the wounded. King Varkos stood at the edge of his throne room, his golden armor covered in dust and streaks of alien blood. But the battle outside was nothing compared to the war raging inside his own heart. His daughter, Princess Solara, lay motionless on a bed of shimmering silk, her breathing shallow. The strange human virus had infected her bloodstream, spreading like wildfire through her veins. Her body, once strong and full of life, now looked frail, her violet skin pale and clammy. Silari healers worked tirelessly, their hands glowing with biotic energy, but nothing could stop the virus. The most advanced medical technology in the empire was useless against this unknown sickness. The king clenched his fists, his massive frame trembling. "Find someone. Anyone. There must be a cure," he roared. "My lord," one of his advisors whispered, his voice laced with fear. "No Xelari can survive exposure to the virus long enough to study it. If we do not act soon, the princess will." The words cut off, but the silence said everything. Varkos closed his eyes, fighting against the crushing weight of helplessness. Then, a desperate idea took root. The Xelari were the most advanced race in the known galaxy, but there was one species that had always defied logic, always found a way to survive. "Summon the human," he ordered. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. A human. No Xelari king had ever lowered himself to seek aid from their kind. The humans were unpredictable, reckless, dangerous. But they were also survivors. Ethan Carter, a human doctor stranded behind enemy lines, had been captured by Xelari forces weeks ago. He had been kept in a secure facility, interrogated for knowledge of Earth's medical advancements. And now he was the only hope the princess had left. Within minutes, 2 Xelari guards dragged Ethan into the throne room. His face was bruised, his uniform torn from weeks of imprisonment, but his eyes burned with defiance. "I hear you need a doctor," Ethan said, his voice rough but steady. Varkos stepped forward, towering over him. "My daughter is dying," he said, his voice thick with desperation. "If you save her, I will grant you freedom. I will grant you anything." Ethan glanced at the princess, his sharp gaze assessing her condition in seconds. "I'll need medical equipment, a sterilized environment. And there is no time for that," the king growled. "You will save her now." Ethan's jaw clenched. The room was filled with hostile eyes, warriors who would rather kill him than trust him. He knew if he failed, he would not leave this palace alive. But as he looked down at Solara, her weak breaths barely moving her chest, something inside him tightened. She wasn't just some alien princess. She was a patient, and he had never let a patient die without a fight. "Fine," he muttered, "but if you want me to save her, you follow my orders." The king nodded, stepping aside as Ethan knelt beside the princess. Ethan worked fast, his hands moving with practiced precision. He pressed his fingers against Solara's wrist. Her pulse was dangerously weak. He checked her eyes, dilated pupils, fever climbing. The virus was shutting down her organs one by one. His mind raced. This wasn't just a virus. It was a genetic weapon, specifically designed to attack Xelari biology. Humans, with their chaotic and adaptable DNA, might be immune. But the princess wasn't that lucky. "Her immune system is collapsing," he muttered. "She needs a direct blood transfusion, the compatible donor." The royal healers hesitated, their faces grim. "There are no Xelari compatible with her bloodline," one of them admitted. "A transfusion would be pointless." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then we make one." Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed a sterilized injector from a nearby medical kit, rolled up his sleeve, and pressed the needle into his own arm. Gasps filled the room as dark red human blood filled the tube. The king stepped forward, eyes blazing. "What are you doing?" Giving her a fighting chance, Ethan shot back. He injected the blood directly into Solara's veins, forcing human antibodies into her system. Seconds passed, then minutes. The tension in the room was suffocating. Solara's body convulsed. Her breath hitched. The monitors tracking her vitals flickered wildly. And then, her heartbeat slowed, steadied. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It's working." The royal healers stared in disbelief. The king looked down at his daughter, his hardened face filled with something like awe. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow. "She's not out of danger yet, but she's fighting back." He turned to Varkos. "Now you need to let me monitor her for the next 24 hours. No interruptions, no threats. If you want her to live, you let me do my job." For a long moment, Varkos simply stared at him. Then, slowly he nodded. Ethan sank into a chair, exhaustion pulling at him. He had just rewritten the rules of Silari medicine, possibly changed the fate of an entire species. And yet, as he looked at Solara, her breathing steady for the first time in hours, he couldn't shake the feeling that his real challenges had only just begun. Because the moment she opened her eyes again, the entire galaxy would change. Ethan sat motionless in the dimly lit chamber, his fingers tapping absently against the edge of the metallic chair. His body ached from exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. The alien princess lay on the bed before him, her breath still shallow but steady, alive. That alone should have been a victory. But Ethan knew better. This was only the beginning. He glanced at the medical monitors hovering beside Solara's bed, analyzing every detail of her condition. The human antibodies in her bloodstream were keeping the virus at bay, but they weren't a cure. If her body rejected the foreign blood, she would relapse, and this time, there would be no second chance. The door to the chamber slid open with a faint hiss, and heavy footsteps echoed through the room. Ethan didn't need to turn around to know who it was. King Varkos. Ethan felt the tension before the king even spoke. There was something almost unnatural about the silence, as if the weight of an entire empire pressed down on the room. "You have done what no auxiliary healer could," the king finally said, his deep voice measured, yet laced with something unfamiliar. "You saved her." Ethan kept his gaze on the monitor. "She's not out of danger yet." A pause. The king stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow over Ethan. "Explain." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The virus hasn't been cured, only suppressed. My blood bought her time, but if we don't create a permanent cure, the infection could mutate, and then even human blood won't save her." King Varkos stiffened. The tension in the room thickened. "Then you will create this cure." Ethan finally looked up, meeting the king's piercing gaze. "I need more than just a lab. I need access to Silari medical research, equipment, and you will have everything." Ethan blinked. He had expected resistance, arguments, conditions, but the king's response was instant, almost desperate. For the first time, Ethan saw it. Beneath the warrior's hardened exterior, beneath the cold and ruthless ruler, there was a father who had nearly lost his child, a father willing to do anything to keep her alive. Ethan stood. "Then let's get to work." Hours passed, then days. Ethan barely left the research chamber, working tirelessly with Silari healers, dissecting the virus at a microscopic level. He quickly realized just how dangerous it was. This wasn't a natural disease. It was engineered. An advanced biological weapon designed to target Silari DNA specifically. But by whom? He set the question aside for later. Right now, the priority was saving Solara. The Silari medical technology was centuries ahead of anything humans had, but they lacked a fundamental understanding of adaptive immune responses. The Silari were a genetically perfected species. Evolution had made them resistant to almost all diseases. They had never encountered a virus they couldn't destroy. Until now. That was why human blood worked. Humanity had evolved in chaos, surviving plagues, wars, and harsh environments. Their immune systems adapted, fought, and endured. Silara needed that same adaptability. But she couldn't live on transfusions forever. Ethan's hands moved swiftly as he synthesized a prototype serum, using a hybrid of human and Silari biological material. If it worked, it wouldn't just suppress the virus, it would rewrite Silara's immune system, making her body capable of fighting the infection on its own. If it failed, Ethan didn't allow himself to think about that. On the third night, as Ethan adjusted the final sequence of the serum, a quiet voice broke the silence. "You haven't rested." Ethan turned. Silara was awake. She was weak, her violet skin still pale, but her silver eyes were clear, aware. It was the first time he had seen her conscious. Ethan grabbed his medical scanner, checking her vitals. "You shouldn't be awake yet." Silara offered a faint smile. "I was never one to follow rules." Despite himself, Ethan chuckled. Figures. Her eyes studied him, curiosity flickering beneath the exhaustion. "You're different from what I expected." Ethan smirked. "Let me guess. Humans are supposed to be violent, reckless barbarians." Silara didn't answer, but her expression said enough. Ethan shrugged. "Well, I'm a doctor. My job isn't to fight. It's to save lives." He paused, then added, "Even alien princesses." Silara's gaze softened. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, an alarm blared through the chamber. Ethan spun toward the monitor. His stomach dropped. The virus was mutating. Silara gasped as pain shot through her body. Her vitals spiked. The human antibodies were losing control. Her body was rejecting them. Ethan grabbed the serum vial. He had been planning to test it first, to be sure it was safe, but there was no time. If he hesitated now, she would die. He pressed the syringe against her arm. "Are you sure this will work?" Silara's voice was barely a whisper. Ethan met her eyes. "No." And then he injected the serum. Silara's body arched as the formula surged through her bloodstream. Her veins pulsed with an eerie golden glow, her muscles seizing as if lightning crackled beneath her skin. The monitors flashed warnings. Temperature rising, heart rate accelerating. Ethan held his breath. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, all at once, Silara gasped and collapsed against the bed. The monitors steadied. Ethan released a breath, his hands shaking. It worked. The virus was gone. The impossible cure had become real. Silara's breathing slowed, her expression relaxing as the pain faded. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. "You did it," she whispered. Ethan managed a tired smile. "Yeah, I did." A heavy silence followed. Then the door slammed open. Cain Varkos stormed into the room, his guards flanking him. His gaze snapped to Silara, then to Ethan. Ethan braced himself, expecting accusations, questions, maybe even threats. Instead, the king did something that shocked everyone in the room. He bowed. The Silari warriors behind him gasped. No Silari king had ever bowed to a human. Ethan's heart pounded. Varkos straightened, his expression unreadable. "You saved my daughter's life," he said. "And for that, I am bound by honor to repay you." Ethan frowned. "I didn't do it for a reward." Varkos exhaled. "Nonetheless, you will have one." He stepped aside. "Name it. Wealth, freedom, whatever you desire." Ethan hesitated. He had expected gratitude, but this was something else. A king's debt was no small thing. But before he could answer, Silara spoke. "He stays." Varkos turned to her, surprised. "Silara." She pushed herself up, her strength returning. "He saved me when no one else could. There is much he can teach us." And she glanced at Ethan, something unreadable in her eyes. "I want him here." Ethan blinked. He hadn't seen that coming. Varkos studied his daughter, then turned back to Ethan. "So be it. he declared. "From this day forward, you are no longer a prisoner. You are an honored guest of the Siluri Empire." Ethan exhaled, a strange mix of relief and unease settling over him. He had come here as a captive. He had saved a princess. And now, he was bound to a world he barely understood. But one thing was certain. His story on Silura was far from over. Ethan barely had time to process his new reality before trouble found him again. His body ached from exhaustion, his mind clouded from days without proper rest. But the moment he opened his eyes, something felt wrong. The air in the chamber was too still, too silent. The faint hum of medical monitors was the only sound, yet his instincts screamed at him. Danger was near. Silura was still asleep, her body recovering from the experimental serum he had injected into her. The princess was out of immediate danger, but she wasn't safe. Not yet. Ethan rose from the chair beside her bed, stretching his stiff muscles. The Siluri Palace was massive, a maze of towering silver walls and intricate carvings glowing with soft blue light. It was a place of power and authority, but Ethan knew better than to assume it was secure. Someone had created that virus to kill Silura. And whoever they were, they wouldn't stop just because Ethan had saved her. His instincts were right. A faint noise, so quiet it was almost imperceptible, echoed through the chamber. A whisper of movement, too smooth to be accidental. Ethan's pulse quickened. He turned slowly, keeping his breathing steady, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place. But that was the problem. The feeling of unease didn't fade. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement in the shadows near the ceiling. A dark silhouette clung to the walls, barely visible against the sleek metallic surface. Ethan's eyes narrowed. He had spent enough time in war zones to recognize an assassin when he saw one. And this one wasn't here for him. Ethan moved without thinking. His body reacted before his mind did, years of battlefield instincts kicking in. He lunged toward the bed, shielding Silura just as the assassin struck. A blade slashed through the air, missing his throat by inches. Ethan hit the ground hard, rolling with Silura in his arms. The princess gasped, jolted awake as the bed collapsed beneath them. The assassin landed gracefully, dark armor reflecting the dim light, twin daggers poised for another strike. Silura's dazed silver eyes widened in horror. "Ethan." "No time," he growled, pushing her behind him. His heart pounded, but he didn't let fear take over. He had been in worse situations before. The trick wasn't to panic, it was to think. The assassin lunged again. Ethan barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as the blade sliced past his face. His mind raced. He was unarmed. The assassin was fast, inhumanly fast. If he didn't do something now, both he and Silura would be dead in seconds. Ethan grabbed the nearest object, a metal tray from the medical station, and deflected the next strike. Sparks flew as the blade scraped against the surface. He used the momentum to shove the tray into the assassin's face, buying himself a few precious seconds. "Guards!" Silura's voice rang through the chamber. The assassin clicked their tongue in frustration. Ethan could barely see their face beneath the dark hood, but he could feel the intensity of their gaze. This wasn't a random attack. This was personal. The assassin lunged again, but this time Ethan was ready. He sidestepped, grabbing the attacker's wrist, twisting it at an unnatural angle. A pained hiss escaped the hooded figure, but they were strong. Too strong. They kicked out, knocking Ethan backward. Pain exploded in his ribs as he crashed into the wall. He gasped, struggling to breathe. The assassin turned toward Silura, who was still weak from her recovery. Ethan gritted his teeth. No, he wouldn't let this happen. He pushed past the pain, diving forward just as the assassin raised their blade over Silura's heart. He tackled the attacker with everything he had. The impact sent them both rolling across the floor. Ethan landed on top, forcing the dagger away from his throat. The assassin fought like a machine, quick, precise, and ruthless. But Ethan had something they didn't: desperation. With a final surge of strength, he slammed his elbow into the assassin's mask. A sharp crack echoed through the room. The assassin let out a muffled curse and recoiled. That was all the opening Ethan needed. He grabbed the dagger from their grasp and drove it downward, pinning the assassin's arm to the ground. A pained cry rang out, but before Ethan could react, the figure twisted unnaturally, slipping free of his grip. The assassin flipped backward, clutching their wounded arm. For a split second, Ethan caught a glimpse of their face beneath the mask. A Xilari. Not just any Xilari, a female warrior with piercing golden eyes, filled with fury and something else. Something deeper. Recognition. The assassin didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their glare said everything. This wasn't over. Then, before Ethan could stop them, they activated a cloaking device. They vanished into thin air. The door burst open. Xilari royal guards stormed inside, weapons drawn, their glowing armor illuminating the room. Cain Varkos followed close behind, his expression darkening at the scene before him. Ethan let out a heavy breath, wiping sweat from his brow. "Took you long enough." Varkos surveyed the destroyed chamber, his eyes narrowing. "What happened?" Ethan stood, still catching his breath. "An assassin." He turned to Silara, who was still on the floor, breathing heavily but unharmed. They were here for her. A dangerous silence settled over the room. Varkos clenched his fists. "Describe them." Ethan hesitated. They were fast, strong, Xilari. He locked eyes with the king, and they knew what they were doing. A shadow crossed Varkos's face. He turned to his guards. "Double the security. No one enters or leaves without my approval." Silara sat up, shaking her head. "Father, who could have done this?" Varkos didn't answer right away. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something Ethan recognized. He knew. "Leave us," Varkos ordered his guards. The soldiers obeyed, filing out one by one. When the doors sealed shut, Varkos exhaled. "This was no ordinary assassin," he admitted. "This was someone with knowledge of the palace, someone with a reason to kill you." His gaze darkened. "A member of the royal court." Ethan's stomach tightened. "You think this was an inside job?" Varkos nodded. "There are those who oppose my rule. They see my daughter as a symbol of unity with the humans, and they would rather see her dead than allow such an alliance to form." Silara's face paled. "You think it's one of our own people?" "I know it is," Varkos said grimly, "and I intend to find out who." Ethan crossed his arms. "Then we need a plan, because if that assassin got in once, they'll try again." Varkos studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Agreed." Silara's hand tightened around Ethan's sleeve. He glanced down, surprised by the touch. Her silver eyes held something new. Fear, but also trust. She trusted him. Ethan exhaled, feeling the weight of what that meant. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He wasn't just a doctor. He was a target now, too. And the fight was just beginning. The palace was no longer a place of peace. It had become a battlefield of whispers and shadows, where every corner held secrets and every face could belong to a traitor. The attack on Princess Silara had changed everything. The assassin had failed, but the message was clear. This was only the beginning. Ethan had been placed under heavy guard, though he didn't trust the Xilari soldiers any more than he trusted the walls around him. The enemy wasn't outside the palace. They were inside. And now, Silara was caught in the middle of it all. Cain Varkos wasted no time. The very next morning, he called an emergency council meeting, gathering his highest-ranking advisors, generals, and warriors. Ethan was summoned as well, though he knew the real reason he was there. He wasn't just Silara's doctor anymore. He was a witness, and more importantly, he was human. As Ethan stepped into the Grand Council chamber, the weight of dozens of alien eyes fell on him. Sealeri nobles and warlords sat around a massive circular table, their armor gleaming under the artificial lights. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Varkos stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. His voice was sharp as he spoke. "There has been an attack on my daughter." His words cut through the silence like a blade. An attack from within. Murmurs erupted across the chamber. Some Sealeri looked at one another in shock. Others remained silent, their faces carefully neutral. Varkos raised a hand, and the room fell quiet again. The assassin was Sealeri, one of our own. This is not an act of war from an outside enemy. This is treason. A general with deep scars across his face leaned forward. "Do we have proof?" Ethan narrowed his eyes. "I fought the assassin myself. They weren't just Sealeri. They were trained. Elite." He crossed his arms, and they were ready to die for their cause. The murmurs returned, louder this time. Another council member, an elder with deep blue skin, spoke. "And what cause would that be, human?" Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "The princess. Someone wants her dead. Someone who fears what she represents." Sealeri stiffened beside him. The meaning was clear. She was the future of the Sealeri, and she had been saved by a human. That alone made her a threat to those who clung to the old ways. A sharp voice cut through the noise. "This is the fault of the humans." All eyes turned to the speaker, a tall, imposing Sealeri warlord, his red eyes burning with anger. "Ever since we allowed this human into our halls, we have known nothing but trouble. A plague nearly killed the princess. Now assassins walk among us. This is no coincidence." Ethan clenched his fists. He had expected this. No matter what he did, there were those who would never accept him. To them, he was nothing more than an invader, a stain on their empire. But before he could speak, Sealeri did. "You are wrong." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Ethan saved my life. Without him, I would be dead." The warlord sneered. Then perhaps that was the natural course of things. The room went dead silent. Varkos' expression darkened with fury. "Watch your tongue, General Zorith." But the damage had been done. The divide was clear now. There were those who stood with the king and those who did not. And Ethan knew what that meant. Civil war. The meeting ended without a clear resolution. There was too much fear, too much uncertainty. The nobles left the chamber in tense silence, their loyalties uncertain. Ethan could feel the storm brewing. This wasn't over. That night, the first attack came. Explosions rocked the palace, shaking the walls with deafening force. Ethan jolted awake as alarms blared through the halls. The air was thick with smoke and panic. Sealeri soldiers rushed past his room, shouting orders in their native tongue. Ethan grabbed his gear and sprinted toward Seleri's chambers. He didn't have to guess who was responsible. This was no mere assassination attempt. This was an uprising. By the time he reached her room, chaos had already erupted. The guards at the door were dead, their bodies slumped against the walls. Inside, Sealeri stood with a blade in hand, her silver eyes sharp with determination. "Are you hurt?" Ethan asked, scanning her for injuries. She shook her head. "No, but we have to get to my father." They moved quickly, navigating through the burning corridors. Bodies littered the palace floors. Sealeri warriors fighting each other, their once united army now turning against itself. Ethan gritted his teeth. This was exactly what the hidden enemy wanted. They hadn't needed to kill Sealeri to win. All they had to do was divide the kingdom from within. As they reached the throne room, they found King Varkos locked in battle. The grand doors had been blasted open, and his royal guards fought desperately against the rebel forces. The king himself stood at the center of it all, his massive war blade cutting through enemy soldiers with brutal precision. Ethan pulled out a stolen plasma pistol and fired into the fray, dropping an enemy soldier before they could reach Varkos. Sealeri joined the fight, her blade flashing through the air. For a moment, it seemed like they had the upper hand. Then General Zoreth appeared. The warlord strode into the throne room like a conqueror, his red eyes gleaming with victory. His forces pushed forward, overwhelming the royal guards. Varkos turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Zoreth. The general smirked. Your rule ends tonight, my king. Varkos tightened his grip on his sword. You betray your own people. I serve them, Zoreth said coldly. Unlike you. He gestured to Solara. You would have us bow to the humans. You would let their influence taint our bloodline. That ends now. Ethan didn't wait for him to finish. He raised his pistol and fired. Zoreth moved impossibly fast, dodging the blast. In the same instant, he lunged forward, his own weapon slicing through the air. Varkos blocked the strike, the impact shaking the ground beneath them. The final battle had begun. Ethan fought beside Solara, covering her as she defended her father. The throne room became a war zone, filled with the sounds of clashing metal and cries of pain. But even as they fought, Ethan knew they were losing. Zoreth's forces outnumbered them. The palace was already in flames. If they stayed, they would die. Varkos knew it too. He turned to Solara, his expression grim. You must go. Her eyes widened in shock. No, I will not leave you. You must. His voice softened, but his gaze was firm. If you die, the auxiliary die with you. Ethan grabbed her arm. He's right. His voice was urgent. We have to go. Now. Solara looked between them, torn between duty and love for her father. Then she clenched her jaw and nodded. Varkos turned to Ethan. Take her far from here. Keep her safe. Ethan met his gaze. I will. The king gave him a final nod before turning back to face Zoreth. Ethan didn't look back. He grabbed Solara's hand and ran. They fled through the hidden tunnels beneath the palace, the sounds of war echoing above them. The battle for the auxiliary throne had begun, and now everything depended on them. Because the war wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The tunnels beneath the palace stretched endlessly, their cold, damp walls lit only by the flickering emergency lights. Ethan could still hear the echoes of battle above. Distant explosions, the clash of weapons, the screams of warriors fighting for their lives. The auxiliary homeworld was at war, and Solara was now its last hope. She ran beside him, her breath sharp, her silver eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They had barely escaped with their lives, but there was no time to think about what they had lost. They needed to survive. They needed to fight back. Ethan kept a firm grip on his plasma pistol as he led the way through the twisting corridors. The tunnels were supposed to be a secret, but he knew better than to trust that. If Zoreth had planned this coup for years, he would have made sure there were no escape routes left open for the royal family. Solara's voice was quiet but firm. Where are we going? Ethan didn't stop moving. The outskirts. We need to find allies. If we stay in the city, we're dead. She clenched her fists. My father is still up there. Ethan stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. Your father gave his life, so you could escape. We can't waste that. Solara took a shaky breath, but she nodded. She knew he was right, even if it broke her heart to accept it. They kept moving, their footsteps echoing through the underground passage. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the tunnel's exit. Ethan peered through the narrow opening before stepping out cautiously. The sight before them was worse than he had feared. The city was burning. Fires raged across the skyline, casting an eerie red glow over the metal structures. Smoke rose into the darkened sky, and the air was filled with the distant hum of warships circling above like vultures. The once great capital of the auxiliary empire was now a battlefield. Solara inhaled sharply, her hands trembling. They really did it. Ethan felt anger burning in his chest. Yeah, and now we make them pay. But first, they needed an army. The rebels controlled the palace, and most of the royal forces had been wiped out. But there was still one place they could go: the slums. The lower districts of the city were home to the outcasts, the criminals, the forgotten soldiers who had been cast aside by the auxiliary elite. If there was any group that would be willing to fight against Zoreth, it was them. It was a risk, but it was the only chance they had. They moved quickly through the ruined streets, avoiding patrols and keeping to the shadows. The slums were quieter than usual, the usual neon lights flickering weakly as the power grid struggled to hold together. Ethan led Silara to an old warehouse, where he knew they would find the one person who could help them. As they stepped inside, dozens of eyes turned toward them. The room was filled with hardened warriors, Silara of different backgrounds, ex-soldiers, bounty hunters, and mercenaries. And standing at the center of it all was a towering figure with deep scars across his face: Korlak, the ex-general of the Silari military. He had been exiled years ago for defying the council's orders, but he had never stopped fighting. And now he might be their only hope. Korlak narrowed his eyes at them. "I never thought I'd see the princess walking into my den." Silara lifted her chin. "My father is dead. Zoreth has taken the palace. We need your help." The room fell silent. Then Korlak let out a low chuckle. "You're either brave or foolish, girl." Ethan stepped forward. "We don't have time for games. Zoreth is tearing this city apart. You want revenge. Now's your chance." Korlak studied him for a moment before nodding. "You've got guts, human." He turned to his men. "Looks like we're going to war." Within hours, the underground rebellion was in motion. Korlak's forces spread through the city, gathering weapons, sabotaging enemy patrols, and spreading chaos among the rebels. They knew they were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of surprise. Zoreth's forces had grown arrogant, believing the war was already won. They were wrong. The final battle began at sunrise. The rebels struck hard and fast, launching attacks across the city. Explosions rocked the streets as Korlak's soldiers stormed key outposts, taking back control of supply lines and weapons caches. The skies filled with dogfights as stolen fighters clashed against Zoreth's warships. Ethan and Silara fought side by side, cutting through enemy ranks with precision. She moved like a true warrior, her blade a blur of silver, while Ethan used every trick he had learned as a soldier. The fighting was brutal. Blood stained the streets, and bodies fell with every passing second. But the tide was turning. Then Zoreth himself entered the battlefield. The warlord descended from his flagship, his massive form clad in reinforced battle armor. His elite guards flanked him, cutting down rebels with ruthless efficiency. Silara's eyes burned with fury. "I'm ending this." She charged forward, blade in hand, and Ethan followed without hesitation. The final confrontation was brutal. Zoreth was fast, his strikes powerful, but Silara was faster. She dodged his attacks with grace, her blade cutting through his defenses. But he was strong, too strong. With a single strike, he sent her crashing to the ground, her weapon slipping from her grasp. He raised his sword for the final blow, and Ethan fired. The plasma bolt hit Zoreth square in the chest, staggering him. It was all the opening Silara needed. With a roar, she lunged forward, driving her blade deep into his heart. Zoreth's eyes widened in shock. Then, with one final gasp, he collapsed. The battlefield fell silent. The war was over. The rebels cheered, their victory secured. The remaining enemy forces surrendered, and by nightfall, the city belonged to them. Silara stood at the heart of it all, her father's legacy now resting on her shoulders. Ethan stepped beside her. "You did it." She turned to him, her expression soft. "We did it." And as the sun rose over the ruined city, a new era for the auxiliary empire began. The battlefield was silent. The war was over. The rebels stood victorious, the banners of the fallen royal family raised once again over the ruined palace. Fires still burned in the distance, smoke curling into the darkened sky, but the sounds of war had faded. Only the whispers of the dead remained. Ethan stood beside Solara, his body aching from the countless wounds he had taken. He had seen war before, had fought in battles that had tested his limits. But this was different. This was not just another war. This was a revolution. Solara, blood-stained and exhausted, turned to face him. Her silver eyes were unreadable, but Ethan could see the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. She had lost her father, her people had suffered, and now she was standing on the edge of a new future, one she had to build with her own hands. But the fight was not over. Not yet. A sharp, high-pitched noise echoed through the sky. Ethan's instincts kicked in immediately, and he grabbed Solara, pulling her down just as an explosion erupted near the palace gates. The rebels scattered, weapons raised, looking for the source of the attack. And then, through the smoke, the final enemy revealed itself. A warship descended from the sky, sleek and deadly, bearing the insignia of Zoreth's strongest ally, the Dominion, an empire known for its ruthless conquests. They had arrived too late to save Zoreth, but not too late to claim the throne for themselves. Ethan clenched his fists. They're not giving up, are they? Solara shook her head, her breathing unsteady. No, they want what Zoreth wanted. Power. From the warship, dozens of armored soldiers poured out, their weapons gleaming in the faint light of the burning city. At the center of them stood a towering figure, clad in dark battle armor. His voice boomed across the ruined palace. The Exilary Empire belongs to the Dominion now. Surrender, and you will be spared. Solara stepped forward, standing tall despite the exhaustion weighing her down. My people will never bow to tyrants. The warlord let out a deep, mocking laugh. Your father said the same thing. And now he's dead. Ethan's grip tightened around his weapon. He knew what this meant. The battle wasn't truly over. Not yet. The Dominion was stronger, better equipped, and prepared to crush whatever resistance remained. The rebels had suffered too many losses already, their forces spread thin. If they fought here now, they would be wiped out. Solara turned to Ethan, her voice low. We can't win this. Ethan hated to admit it, but she was right. Not like this. Not with what little they had left. But there was still a way. It wasn't a battle they needed to fight with guns or blades. It was a battle of strategy, of sacrifice. Ethan turned to Korlak, the exiled general who had fought by their side. How many explosives do we have left? Korlak frowned but answered quickly. Enough to level this entire section of the city. That was all Ethan needed to hear. He looked at Solara, his heart heavy. Get your people out of here. She frowned, confused. What? No, we fight. We can't win this fight, Solara, Ethan interrupted. But we can make sure they don't win either. Realization dawned on her face. You're not. I am, Ethan said, his voice calm. Solara's hands clenched into fists. No, there has to be another way. There isn't. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm yet gentle. They want this city. They want the throne. We're not going to give it to them. She shook her head, anger and sorrow mixing in her gaze. Ethan, you don't have to do this. Yes, I do. He gave her a small smile, the kind that carried both regret and determination. You need to lead these people now. You need to build something better. Her breath hitched. Then fight with me. He wished he could. He really did. But this was the only way to make sure the future she wanted could exist. Ethan turned to Korlak. Take everyone and retreat. Get as far away from here as possible. Korlak studied him for a long moment before nodding. He understood. He always had. Solara, however, wasn't willing to accept it. I'm not leaving you. Ethan exhaled sharply. You have to. Her hands trembled as she grabbed his arm. Don't do this. He leaned in, his forehead pressing lightly against hers for just a brief second. You gave me a reason to fight for something more than just survival. Now let me do the same for you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she knew there was no changing his mind. And so, with a heavy heart, she turned away. The rebels moved quickly, retreating into the distant tunnels, vanishing into the night. Ethan stood alone now, facing the advancing army. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. The Dominion soldiers moved closer, their weapons aimed at him. The warlord sneered. "Where is your army, human?" Ethan smirked. "Right under your feet." And with that, he pressed the detonator. A massive explosion erupted beneath the warlord's forces, engulfing them in flames and destruction. The palace crumbled. The very ground shaking this fire consumed everything in its path. The Dominion's warship tried to retreat, but the shockwave caught it, sending it spiraling into the ruins. It was over. The enemy had been destroyed, and Ethan was gone. Far from the ruined city, Solara stood atop a cliff, watching as the flames consumed what remained of the palace. Her hands were clenched at her sides, her heart aching with a loss she hadn't been prepared for. Korlak stood beside her, silent. The rebels had survived. The Exilary Empire had a chance to rebuild, but the cost had been heavy. Solara closed her eyes, whispering a promise to the wind. "I will honor you, Ethan. I will make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain." And as the first light of dawn broke across the sky, the future of the Exilary Empire was born, not through conquest, but through the sacrifice of a single human who had fought, not for power, but for the hope of something greater.